that's the sign of a good song, in my opinion, is if you can write it for some universal human experience that isn't just what's happening today, but might actually become more relevant in the future. Yeah, it was written many years ago, but I assume you're speaking of Faith Alone. One of the great things about Bad Religion is that it's always given us a place to write about topical things that are timeless. And of course, faith, the tension between faith and science and reason and unreason are almost universal human experiences that go on and on. And what we resolve today will probably hopefully get us a little closer to that apex of enlightenment, but there'll be more hurdles to cross, I'm sure. As a songwriter, you sort of try and stimulate multiple areas of the brain, hopefully in the listener who's going to be hearing it. And so I've always focused a lot on meaning and expression, the human qualities of the songs I write. How do you express this? How do you make it, how do you create the impression in the listener that this is a serious topic? And, I think that's one of the things that good singers that I've always admired. That's always something they've been able to do. It makes you realize this is a serious song. It doesn't have to even be a serious topic. It can be a love song about a personal emotion, but it's the good singers make you believe that it's something worth listening to and the sentiment in the song. So to me, if there's too much orchestration, it gets lost, it takes away from that. Brett took my stripped down version, which, I just write things on piano or acoustic guitar. And if it's going to be for the full production in the studio, if it's a Bad Religion album, oftentimes I will try and shape it a little bit with how I think it should sound. Let Brian take this part, but I'll give it a little electric guitar on there to show what I'm thinking. Let Jay do something with the bass, but I'll give a little rudimentary bass line. But then sometimes, like this song, Faith Alone, it's just a piano and a sentiment. And Brett took that and he did the orchestration with one of his favorite string players, who is, I forgot his name, I'm so sorry, but the point is, Brett, as the producer, took it and he thought it would accentuate it. And I remained open-minded because I didn't know what it was going to do. And when it came back, it was like, wow, this is amazing. This really helps accentuate the sentiment in the song, but it doesn't get in the way. And that's, I think, that's the key to creating Faith Alone 2020. It's been 30 years since that song was written. It still has the same power that it had back then. To me, that's a really good indication that there's something worth hanging on to in that sentiment. The title is obviously taken from one of not only the band's favorite songs to play, but it's one of the fan favorites too. And I think that played heavily into Jim and Jay, I think, helped title it. And I think that played heavily into their decision. It's a fan favorite. But it also kind of does characterize the book, because this story is one that shows, a lot of persistence. We have a lot of persistence, I think you could say, but we never set out to restrict anyone's activities or anyone's beliefs or anyone's willingness to participate in the band. We've never had a rule book. It's never been a strict adherence to these principles and this work ethic. We all really just did what we wanted, if you want to use the title. Brett was motivated to run Epitaph Records from a very young age. I was motivated to get an academic education. We weren't going to hold each other accountable for how is that going to help the band, Jay and Greg Hetson and everyone had their own endeavors. Brian, of course, is still in many side projects today. I have some solo albums out there. I write books. Brett signs bands from all over the world, and he's active with Epitaph every day of his life. If you look at it from that perspective, it looks like we're a bunch of guys just doing what we want, but there's something that comes together when we decide to make Bad Religion music, and it's informed by all those outside activities. And I think that's part of the strength of the band. Going into it, again, there were no rules or ground rules. So, Jim did a great job of interviewing. Jim Ruland, the author, did a great job of interviewing people far and wide. We didn't know what information he was getting. And we didn't act as editors. So we didn't, he had an editor, and that we expected him to deal with the editor on those things. But that's not to say we didn't learn some things, I mean, I guess a lot of it we forgot, and then one of the other guys tells a story and, oh yeah, that's right. And, Jay has this great memory for details in the band. And Brett and I just laughed so hard when we learned, reading it from the first time, the reason that Jay Ziskraut, our first drummer, left the band. And Jay remembered it to the detail. And then it was corroborated by the original drummer, Jay Ziskraut. So he left the band because we looked at photographs and chose a picture for the album, and we didn't include him in that meeting. As 15 and 16-year-old kids might do, they just rummage through the photographs without carefully considering calling a band business meeting. So apparently that's why he quit the band, and he corroborated it. So yeah, you learn little things like that, but there was nothing that shocking, nothing that we weren't aware of. I knew he left the band, but I didn't know the details. I assume you mean, are they going to show up at the polls? I honestly just expect a lot of meddling and a lot of obstruction. Luckily I live in a place in upstate New York here where it's never very crowded and it's very convenient. I've always had great experience voting in New York. So California, I've had various experiences, but it's a lot more crowded. And if they close precincts, close voting booths, then it's, I have friends who, have to devote half their day to voting. I mean, it shouldn't be like that. So, yeah, I do feel like there's more motivation this time around. Mine was an academic family in the Rust Belt. It's not even conceivable that you wouldn't vote. I mean, it's inconceivable. And that's the way, I have kids who are adults now, and that tradition is passed on to them. So I don't understand the apathy. I don't get it. People think they're making a point by not voting. You're kind of missing it there. So that's why it's so important that we make it as easy as possible. It's not something that should be difficult. It should be very, very easy, so that the apathy, which I guess is part of human nature, if it's that prevalent, then we have to acknowledge that it's prevalent and do everything we can to provide an infrastructure so that that can be nullified. It's beyond me how anyone could, just as a protest vote, not vote for Joe Biden. Even if you're not very behind the guy, it's the antipathy towards the current administration has never been stronger. And I just can't, I don't see how you can mess this one up. Your topic is huge. It requires, a semester of study. It also requires a long answer. I can touch on a couple things that I've recognized. Part of it is this notion that it is possible. You can be cautiously optimistic and say, yeah, the old model of touring is going to come back. You know, that's the cautious optimism, that the model we used before, where a band sells out an auditorium and that sustains their performance fee and it sustains the payroll of everybody on board. You know, it provides a full auditorium for selling merchandise and alcohol and all of that. That's a business model that has worked in the past. And there's cautious optimism that it will work as soon as we get a vaccine. That's one way of looking at it, and that's certainly fine to be cautiously optimistic. And I'm not an expert on rock and roll touring business model. I'm not an expert. I'm a performer. I've participated in it for 40 years, probably paid attention to the business aspects of it for the last 15, but I still am not that, I don't consider myself a deep thinker when it comes to business models. But I am an anthropologist. I feel like I am an observer. And one thing, you know, we never would have thought that a new model would be viable for consuming music, listening to music, right? And today, here we are streaming most of our music, and people are enjoying music more than ever, you could argue. So there's more consumption, if you want to use that word, than ever before, simply because it's so easy to access. Never mind the fact that the creators aren't getting paid as much per listen. Forget that. The point is, more people are consuming it, and that could be seen as an area of very optimistic growth in the future. So given that we can't really predict the future, it seems to me that now is a very interesting transitional time. You can be comfortable in your cautious optimism and think that, well, we'll just hold out until a new vaccine is created and we'll go back to the old ways and we'll probably be successful doing it. That's sort of one way. But this interesting transition provides an opportunity. And that is, I'm starting to see glimmers of it. And that's the idea that bands could be in partnership with promoters to provide streaming content of live shows with or without people. So regardless of whether or not people are in the venue, you know, what if you go to the Agora Theater, you say, hey, we're coming to Cleveland, we're going to play the Agora. I believe that there are people who would be excited to see that because they love the Agora Theater, right? So they're like, you know, I can't really make that show, but man, I'm gonna tune into that. I want to see that. So the band has to create their own bubble like the NBA, but we would do it on a tour bus and, you know, an antiseptic backstage area maybe. But we would put together a tour in a bubble, essentially. And the ticket buying is different because you're not going to be, at least when there's a pandemic, you're not going to be going to the venue, but you're watching it on your device. And so there is an opportunity to sell tickets to that. I'm not a businessman and I don't know the business model of that, but there seems to me to be a way to get enough revenue to cover the costs, to pay the fees, and to pay the staff who have to be there to open the venue and to run the venue. And it seems to me that the bands that are doing that are sort of more forward thinking right now. And they're doing it not just to get this bridge, you know, between now and when there's a vaccine, but to actually use it as a business model for the future as well. And it just seems like that you, as a band, you should be thinking that way, thinking about what the future is going to hold. We don't know if there'll be another pandemic, at which time you could just easily transition by using your streaming model. Even if there are audiences again as full and as crammed as before. Why not use a streaming model with a full audience too? Some people might like to see that. So you could oversell the venue and still make more revenue. The point is, again, I don't know the feasibility of these things, but I do know that to think forward and to look at this as a transition time it's got to be, you've got to be modern in your approach, because if not, you're just going to be hoping for the return of the past, which might or might not be the same. We don't know how people are going to respond. I believe they want to go back and they want to slam dance, because I believe that there's something timeless about that. But the evolutionary biologist in me is always looking at times of crisis as kind of like mass extinction events in the history of life. And the ones that made it through the mass extinction were the ones that were lucky enough, in this case, the bands that are lucky enough to have a following who want to see them. But in a mass extinction, they were lucky enough to come up with a different way of life that was going to be able to adapt to the new climate conditions or the new environment. And I think there is a new environment out there. And whether or not it'll go back to the old environment is immaterial to the new business models that could be created right now. Because you may find a business model that's even more lucrative and more successful than the old one. So I always, my ears are wide open at this time. And, the promoters haven't been that active in coming up with these ideas. I think a lot of them are really hurting, and I feel for them. But hopefully, some of them will hurt a little less and come up with some new creativity to include bands that could work in partnership. Here's the thing, I'm not a health expert. Health science is not my bag, but this does have an evolutionary biology component to it. We focus on the changes to the population. So even though this is a tragedy right now, it's, the focus is on how is this affecting our population right now? And of course, we're trying to flatten the curve for the health industry so that we don't overwhelm the hospitals and the healthcare professionals. And that is something that actually works. If you slow the rate of infection, lower the transmission rate, you're going to have a slower onset of infection. What's important from an evolutionary perspective is that you're not eliminating the organism. You're not eliminating the symbiotic relationship of a virus and its host. You're simply stretching it out over time by lowering the rate of incidence. So it remains to be seen what effect this is going to have on our population. Certainly, if we get a vaccine, then we are going to effectively eliminate the environment in which the organism, the parasite can spread. You're eliminating, the environment it lives is in our own pulmonary epithelium, in our lung tissue. That's its environment. So if we can create a vaccine and everyone takes that vaccine, you're eliminating a viable, living, and reproducing environment for the virus. So I'm speaking very elementary here, but probably most of your readers know that. But the point is, if you can eliminate an environment, then you're effectively, taking away the most important variable in the life and the reproduction of the virus. But that's not to say, like you mentioned, that it can't mutate. As of a couple weeks ago, the latest news was that this this virus, the proteins on this virus don't mutate very fast. It's not like H1N1, it's not like influenza. So again, that's the cautious optimism, that, don't take it from me, go check, what the latest CDC recommendation is or something. But the latest that I saw as of a few weeks ago, the initial reports were that the virus proteins don't mutate very fast. So that's a good sign that a vaccine will be successful. But these are the kinds of the families of viruses that tend to find animal reservoirs, meaning they find another species that doesn't have access to vaccines, and they can go to those, they can spread rapidly in other species. And if we're not careful, that is, human beings aren't careful, and we come in contact with that reservoir species, be it at a wet market where they're selling illegal pets, or if it's at a some kind of exotic food market somewhere, it can jump from those that species. It can jump back into humans, and the problem there is that in the reservoir species, it has time to mutate, even if it's a slow mutation rate, like they're finding in this novel coronavirus. Even if it's slow, it can take its time, and 5 years from now, we're dealing with another SARS coronavirus outbreak. So, I think we're learning a lot about the right and the wrong ways to deal with a pandemic of this nature. And I think the therapeutic approaches to treating it will get better. And I think we'll learn more about the organism, and hopefully, the vaccine will be, we will have it, we can maybe anticipate it, or at least have the rudiments in place, and certainly have the testing materials in place before the next one. So there's reason to be optimistic.